The software that a lot of people use to run their Bambu Lab printers, Bambu Studio, is open source. It's built on a license with one simple rule. If you use open source code, you have to pass your own version on, just as openly. And that rule, Bambu's own license, is the one Bambu Lab might now be breaking. For weeks, a fight over this has been building, escalating step by step. One developer was contacted by Bambu Lab with a reference to legal action. One of the most experienced open source organizations in the world is talking about confirmed violations. And a lot of users are asking themselves one question. What does this mean for me? And should I even be buying a Bambu Lab printer at all? So I went through the whole case, calmly, the accusations, Bambu's response, the license itself. And I will walk you through what I found, in order without any drama. So by the end of that video, you can judge yourself what's really going on here. If you watched any 3D printing videos lately, this topic has almost certainly crossed your feed. Bambu Lab and the AGPL. What started with one developer's software post has turned into a real storm. One that's pulled in not just consumer rights advocate Louis Rossmann, but now also the Software Freedom Conservancy, a US non-profit that works to keep open source license enforced. But why is this escalating right now? And what made the whole community boil over like this? What looks like one big story is really a chain of events that build on each other right up to today. And once I worked through that chain, it became clear what it is actually about. It started already back in January 2025. That's when Bambu Lab changed, through a firmware update, how software is allowed to talk to its printers. Certain commands like starting a print, controlling the heaters, now only run through certified software, Bambu's own slicer, Bambu Studio, or a new piece of middleware called Bambu Connect. If you only use Bambu Studio or the phone app, you notice nothing. But if you used a third-party slicer like Orca Slicer to send print files to your Bambu printer, you were out of luck. Past a certain firmware version, the direct route was closed. There was only one way around it, putting the printer into a pure developer LAN mode. But that effectively cuts it off from Bambu's cloud, and you give up conveniences like printing from the phone app. That caused a real stir at the time. I made a detailed video about it back then on my German channel. I will link it above. The part that stung most: after buying the printer, a feature that used to be there was quietly restricted. And that frustration never fully went away. It stayed quite in the background. Until in April 2026, a Polish developer named Paweł Jacek uploads something to GitHub. He releases his own variant of Orca Slicer that restores exactly the feature missing since January 2025. The direct route to the printer. No detour through Bambu Connect and no need to force the printer into LAN mode. Bambu Lab notices the project and contacts Jacek. According to the accounts, Bambu points to its terms of use, to legal context, and to a possible cease and desist, and accuses him, among other things, of reverse engineering. And this is based on the accounts of those involved. The actual correspondence isn't public. Jacek then takes his project offline voluntarily. Important, without admitting to any of the accusations. He didn't take it down because he thought Bambu was in the right. He took it down out of an understandable fear of a legal fight. On one side, a single private individual, on the other, a company with a legal department. The balance of power here is just very uneven. And that step, a large company putting pressure on a single developer, is the moment the story tips over. Consumer rights advocate Louis Rossmann picks up the topic. Rossmann had already been covering Bambu Lab critically since January 2025. And now he re-uploads Jacek's code under his own account and challenges Bambu Lab to come after him instead of Jacek. And that sets off a real chain reaction. The code gets copied and mirrored over and over, and to this day more than 4,000 copies are available online. And it doesn't stop there. The Software Freedom Conservancy steps in. The non-profit that works to keep open source licenses enforced, and it gets straight to work. It takes Jacek as a volunteer, launches a project called Bambu, and announces it will deliberately rebuild the closed network plugin to create an open version of it. On top of that, the SFC says it will thoroughly investigate how Bambu Lab handles the license and keep a permanent eye on the company going forward. Bambu Lab then responds in an article on All3DP and walks one point back. The company admits that its reference to the terms of use and a possible cease and desist came across as a legal threat, and that this wasn't the outcome it wanted. And with that, the real question has shifted. This is no longer just about firmware features being taken away. It's about the license that Bambu's own software is built on in the first place. And that license is the AGPL, the Affero General Public License, one of the strictest so-called copyleft licenses. Copyleft is the counterpart to the classic copyright. Instead of restricting use, it locks openness in. The right you receive, you have to pass on. For a company, that means something very concrete. If you take someone else's open code as your foundation, you have to release your own version of it openly too. You take something from the community and you give something back. Bambu did exactly that. Large parts of Bambu Studio are open to inspect, all except one single piece, the closed networking plugin. And that one piece is where everything is decided. Let's look at the arguments of both sides, Bambu Labs and the critics. But first, one question needs answering. Why does the AGPL even apply to Bambu Studio? Why is Bambu Studio open source software in the first place? The answer is in where the software comes from. Bambu Studio isn't an original built from scratch. It's a descendant. From the Open Slicer came Prusa Slicer, and from that came Bambu Studio, and from Bambu Studio later came Orca Slicer. A whole family of slicers, all standing on the same open foundation. And with the code, you inherit the license, because Bambu Studio builds on AGPL code. Bambu Studio itself is covered by the AGPL. And the AGPL doesn't ask for just some of the code. It asks for all of it. Everything needed to actually rebuild and modify the software. The license calls this the corresponding source, and this matters. That explicitly includes parts that ship separately, but that the program is so tightly interlinked with that it can't function without them. That's written into the AGPL license text itself, and this is exactly where the story splits into two camps. Bambu Lab says the networking plugin is a standalone, optional piece of software. It ships separately, the user decides whether to install it, and it only adds extra features, so it isn't part of the source that has to be disclosed. Bambu Lab also argues its cloud is a private service. Access to it is governed by terms of use, not by an open source license. A code license, they say, is not a free pass to the server infrastructure. And Bambu says this assessment has been checked legally. Back in 2022, when developer Roy Karlsbach first raised the question, Bambu Lab wrote in a blog post that it has cleared with its lawyers and industry expert, and it stands by that to this day. The other side says that's not how it works, and they aren't relying on guesswork. They are relying on Bambu Lab's own visible code. The core of their argument is optional and separate only describes the plugin on paper. In reality, Bambu Studio loads the closed plugin into its own program flow at startup. It knows exact name and version and calls more than 100 individual functions from it. Login, print jobs, camera, file transfer. The picture the critics paint. These aren't two separate programs that occasionally talk to each other. It's one program split across two files. Through a mechanism called a callback, the closed part can even send code back into the open application. And this view isn't new. Joseph Prusa himself, the founder of the competitor Prusa Research, whose Prusa Slicer was the template for Bambu Studio, says the violation has existed since the very first fork. He says he raised this topic back in March 2023. And as far back as November 22, developer Roy Karlsbach pointed to possible licensing problems with Bambu Studio in a blog post. And how does the Software Freedom Conservancy sees it? It now rates 2 points as confirmed violations. First, the closed networking plugin, for which Bambu Lab does not provide the complete source code, And second, the pressure put on Jacek because the AGPL forbids restricting the rights it grants through additional threats. And there's still the accusation of reverse engineering. Bambu Lab accuses the developer of deliberately circumventing technical protection measures. Jacek disputes that he says he never opened the closed plugin, but worked solely with Bambu's public code. And here's the irony of the story. The SFC is now openly doing reverse engineering on the plugin and points to the AGPL as giving the user exactly that right. So both sides are now on the table. If the critics are right, the plugin is part of the source that must be disclosed. And Bambu Lab is keeping it closed when it shouldn't. If Bambu Lab is right, it doesn't have to open the plugin. So it all comes down to one single question. Is the network plugin a standalone optional piece of software? Or is it so tightly woven into Bambu Studio that it belongs to the source code that has to be disclosed? Bambu Lab says one thing, Prusa, the SFC and the developer says the other. And the SFC isn't just any voice here. It's one of the most experienced open source licensing organizations there is, and one of its leading figures helped write the exact license clause this whole thing turns on. When an organization like that talks about confirmed violations, that carries a weight. But no court has decided this yet. It's an expert assessment, not a ruling. So a finished answer is something we don't have here. And that question may stay open for months, maybe years, if it ever even reaches a real legal battle. But you probably already own a Bambu Lab printer or you're about to buy one. So the question you most likely care about is a very practical one. What does all this fighting actually mean for you? Today, concretely. The good news first, for the vast majority, nothing changes right now. If you're inside the Bambu ecosystem, printing with Bambu Studio and the phone app, your printer keeps working exactly as before. That's the software Bambu Lab intends and certifies, and in day-to-day use, you will notice nothing of this whole fight. And if you use Orca Slicer, then basically nothing changes for you either. The developer LAN mode that Orca Slicer uses to talk to the printer keeps working as before, for now. This new fight hasn't changed that yet. It gets interesting when you look ahead, because what could change actually points the other way. For Orca Slicer users, more routes could open up in the future, not fewer. Jacek's variant lives on, mirrored many times over, and the SFC is working on an open network plugin in the Bambu project. Whether an openly rebuilt plugin will work with Bambu's cloud long-term is still open. That depends on how Bambu Lab proceeds. Bottom line, today this fight forces you to do nothing. Your printer does what it should, and over the coming months, more options could open rather than fewer. What this fight does raise, though, is a moral question. And that one only each person can answer themselves. Up to here, those were the facts, as neutrally as I could put them together. Now I also want to give you my personal opinion, and I want to keep it clearly separate from that. One thing up front, I have, even if people sometimes assume otherwise, no relationship with Bambu Lab beyond the affiliate links under my videos. And honestly, sometimes I would like to get printers for free to test instead of constantly funding everything with my own money. But right now, in situations like this, I'm glad it's not that way. I can speak freely with no strings attached. The only thing Bambu Lab could take from me is access to their affiliate program, and that's a risk I will take. Clear words matter more to me here. First of all, I don't think a company automatically has to allow every kind of access to its servers. That right stays completely untouched for me. Bambu Lab can decide that only its own software talks to the servers. And in the same way, any company is free to offer a product as closed source. For me, 3D printing doesn't have to be open source. But every company has to follow the law, and that includes license terms. Bambu Lab built on open source software from the start. That was a massive advantage. They could build on the work countless volunteers had done over the years, from the developers of the original slicer to Prusa's team. Whether the networking plugin ultimately counts as a separate or not, I can't judge. That's a legal question. But I do believe this. Anyone who wants to build a closed system would have been better off writing their own slicer from the start. That would have been a consistent choice. And if it had gone that way, nobody would be upset today. Bambu Lab could still build good, affordable printers and keep its software closed. I don't even think it would have hurt their success. Many people who just use their printer as a tool probably haven't noticed any of this debate. Whether the software is open source or closed source makes no difference to them. They just use Bambu Studio and the phone app. But for those who have noticed and who care about how companies behave morally, this whole thing leaves another scratch on Bambu Lab's image. It simply has a bad aftertaste, and at least with the people I've spoken to, it gets a shake of the head. The question is, what does Bambu Lab do now? If they open the network plugin and offer a properly documented local interface, the problem itself would be off the table, but the damage to the image would remain. They could also build their own slicer from scratch without anyone else's open source code. Then it would be a cleanly closed system and the license question would be settled, but that means an enormous amount of work. And if they do nothing while the SFC succeeds with its open networking plugin, how does Bambu Lab react then? Do they change the authentication mechanism again to lock out a reverse engineer plugin too? Or do they let it run? What happens to the developer LAN mode, and could a decision end up being forced by a court? Right now, nobody knows. Honestly, it makes me a little sad that printers this easy to use and this affordable can't be recommended without reservation right now because of the kind of behavior. If you only look at the technical side and you're staying inside the Bambu ecosystem anyway, there's still basically nothing speaking against a Bambu Lab printer. But if you care about staying independent of the manufacturer and not being at mercy of future firmware decisions, then recommending Bambu Lab is difficult right now, given how unresolved and fast-moving this is. And if you factor in the moral side of it, then as of now, you really can't buy Bambu Lab anymore. If you are unsure now, my advice would be wait and see how this develops, or start looking at alternatives now. And that brings me to the question of how I will handle Bambu Lab myself going forward. I will keep using my Bambu Lab printers. In terms of function, they are among the best on the market for me, affordable and a genuine driver of innovation. And that's something I support at its core. I started this channel with one question. Why does almost every household have a printer for paper but not a 3D printer? And with the X1C came the turning point for me. 3D printing suddenly got so easy that you could use a printer without having to dive deep into the technical details. You still could, but you no longer had to. And I'm convinced the easier and the more accessible 3D printing gets, the more people can put this amazing technology to use. Switching off a printer you've already bought and throwing it away just because of this debate, that wouldn't be a rational thing to do. So I will keep reviewing Bambu Lab printers and filaments on this channel. But for the time being, I will add a short note under those videos pointing to the ongoing discussion. I'm definitely keeping an eye on how this develops. And if you're interested, I will happily do an update on it. And now I want to hear your take. Do you still use Orca Slicer or third-party hardware with your Bambu Lab printer? Or is what Bambu Studio offers enough for you? Let me know in the comments, and please keep it civil and argue your case reasonably. If this breakdown helped you, leave a like or a sub, it supports the channel. Thanks for watching and seeing you in the next one.